So I just want to remind you of the requirements for pesticide safety information series, safety data sheets, labels, and a bunch of other acronyms. Okay. Pesticide labeling. You have to provide specific information these are for your handlers, right? So this is what you're supposed to do as a supervisor, provide specific information on how to apply the formulated product, how to protect handlers and field workers during the application. And then you have to provide safety data sheets for all recent pesticide application. So safety data sheets provide hazard, emergency medical treatment, and other safety information. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm saying this all wrong. So pesticide labels give you specific information on how to apply the product, right? And the safety data sheet provides hazard and emergency medical treatment. And so both are required. So if you don't have a label because you're doing an experimental pesticide research, well, then you have to have the safety data sheet and some sort of experimental protocol, right? Okay, but the label is always the primary document. The safety data sheet is required to be displayed. Yes, displayed. But that's not what's going to tell you how to mix the pesticide and what specific PPE you need for every situation. Okay, so you need both of those pieces of information. So safety data sheets all have these sections and in this order. And we talked about section 2 on hazards identification already. And so sometimes the signal words on a label doesn't match the signal word on the safety data sheet. So that's why I say, so for example, this is just Daconil. Here it's caution on the EPA registered label, but here on the safety data sheet, it's danger. Okay. If you have a label, that's your primary document, and then you follow this signal word because they come from different places. This signal word is talking about you as the pesticide handler, what the potential acute toxicity is to you, the person mixing, loading, and applying the pesticide. This signal word is like if it's corrosive to metal or if it's an environmental hazard or something like this. So it's the signal word on the label. If you have a label, you follow the label signal word. So any information you have on the label, that is primary. SDS is supplemental to that, okay? Not in place of. But if you don't have a label, then you have to rely exclusively on the safety data sheet. So we have these things called Pesticide Safety Information Series, the A8 for ag handlers, and the A9 for field workers, which is ag, or also sometimes people are using the N8, which is non-ag for handlers. This is California's hazard communication system for our field workers and our pesticide handlers. So it says in these documents, you have the right to look at pesticide use records, applicable pesticide safety series leaflets, and safety data sheets for all the pesticides used where you work in the last 2 years. And so here's where these records are kept. So you have to tell people that this pesticide safety information series tells them this. The records are kept here, and then you have to display this pesticide safety information series. So whereas a copy of the label also has to be available at each use site. So the label or whatever experimental protocol that you're using. So if you don't have a label because you're using a numbered compound, presumably you have an experimental protocol that helps you, mix it properly and get the right rate. So whatever, either the label or that experimental protocol has to be available at each use site. So this is a mixed load site. Here's the storage. So maybe you're, measuring it out at the storage. If you're using that pesticide or your employees are, then you have to have the label available. So there are central displays, and you have to provide application specific information and safety data sheets. So I don't want to go into like the nitty gritty details of this, but this is, let me see if I have another picture after this. No, I don't, of course not. There's application specific information, which is detailed in the pesticide safety information series. Basically, it's a record of all recent applications because that allows employees, so these are 2 employees are getting ready to go into a field and do field work. They don't have PPE on because they're not handling pesticides. So they're looking at the list of recently applied pesticides to make sure the field that they are supposed to enter does not have a restricted entry interval in effect at that time. Okay. So any questions on when to provide labels or safety data sheets? Basically, you have to have them both. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. So I want to go into reentry and posting requirements. I probably won't go into all the details on this because a lot of times the details don't apply to the majority of people. But if you do have follow-up questions, I would like to hear them. So we talked about the restricted entry interval. No person shall enter any treated area with a pesticide, area treated with the pesticide, unless they are following the label directions for early entry. So if there's a 24-hour restricted entry interval, then you're not going to enter the field during that 24-hour period unless you're following label instructions for PPE, for the specific tasks you're allowed to do. You have to be 18 and you have to be properly trained. If you have a QAL or QAC, you're trained. You're trained up. Okay. So there are certain pesticide active ingredients in California that have their state specific restricted entry interval. And most of these don't apply to us because they're not commonly used or they're no longer registered or allowed. But I did want to point this one out. So sulfur, this one might apply to some of you in the room. I'm not sure. So sulfur for grapes, here it says it's 3 days. The H is a footnote. All of these numbers are in days. This is not hours. So here it says the REI for sulfur being applied to grapes is 3 days, which is significantly longer than the label tells you, right? So don't worry, go to the footnote. It's very specific circumstances. So the REI for sulfur only applies in the Central Valley. So it lists out the counties. And it's May 15th through harvest or March and April down in Riverside because it's the south end of the valley. So, sometime, and then this comite and omite also, they have some specific restricted entry intervals. So if you recognize any of these active ingredients, you need to refer to this list. And if the restricted entry interval on this list is more strict than what the label says, then you have to do the more strict restricted entry interval. So most of the time we're going to find our restricted entry interval in the ag use requirements box. So this is a very ag construct. So if you're doing research in an ag production commodity, then this message is for you. So here, let me see. Okay, so here it says, do not enter or allow worker entry into treated areas during the restricted entry interval of 24 hours. Except for the following: onions, garlic, and horseradish is 48 hours. So you have to go to the ag use requirements box so to know like what the restricted entry interval is. But here, this ag use requirements box says the REI for each crop is listed in the directions for use. So there's too many different REIs to list here. So the first stop is ag use requirements to figure out if the REI is there or if you need to go somewhere else. And then the ag use requirements box is going to tell you if posting is required by the label. Posting is a sign that says do not enter until the REI is over, right? This particular pesticide says notify workers of the application by warning them orally. We always notify people orally, and by posting warning signs. So if it says and by posting warning signs, that means you have to post, you have to post a warning sign. This particular pesticide doesn't say anything at all about posting, the second one here, which means the label itself doesn't require posting. That doesn't mean that posting is not required. It's just the label doesn't require it. So field posting, it's because there's California requirements. So the field posting requirements are based on the label and on California code. So it gets a little complicated. So, okay, let's not do the poll because I see I'm running out of time. So this sign is the California sign. It's important that you're using a sign with the skull and crossbones, not the angry rancher, because that is a federal sign. It's not a keep out sign. It's not a no trespassing sign. It's an illegal sign. So don't use it. You see them, don't use them. Just don't buy them. You can buy them on Gamblers, but just really never buy them. So in California, we have our own specific posting signs. They have a skull and crossbones. Everything else about the sign is essentially the same. This one's particularly dirty, so not a great example, but it says danger, pesticides, keep out. And it's in English and in Spanish. You have to be able, a person with regular eyesight or corrected eyesight has to be able to read it from 25 feet. So if you're making a pesticide application in a greenhouse, you have to post the sign during the REI, period. If you're making a pesticide application in like a hoop house, like where we grow some of our raspberries, or in a mushroom house, something that's not completely enclosed, if the REI on the label is greater than 4 hours, you have to post this sign. Well, if the label requires posting, like we saw in the previous slide, obviously you have to post this sign during the restricted entry interval. And then there's this other thing. If the REI on the label is greater than 48 hours, you have to post a sign. So sometimes more than one of these things is correct. It's true, not correct. It's true. So if any of these things are true, you have to post this sign. Okay. There's also signs that have more information that are required at the bottom. And these are required if your REI is greater than 7 days. You can use these even when they're not required, but if you use a sign that has blanks to be filled in, you have to fill in the blanks. The ag commissioner, like the inspectors, the county inspectors, they don't like empty blanks. They are not going to walk past it. They're going to say something. They're going to, follow up with you about it. So if you choose to use the sign, even if you don't need to, you still have to fill in the blanks. So you have to say the pesticide, the grower, which means just the person responsible, and when the REI expires. I'm sure most people are not applying soil fumigants in there, but if you are, then you probably already know this. There's a special posting sign for soil fumigants, and then there's a buffer zone posting for the soil fumigants. And then if you're applying pesticides in an irrigation system, we have an extra sign that's California specific that needs to be used. So if you're chemigating, applying in an irrigation system, and the signal word on the pesticide label is danger, then you have to post whatever sign is required, like the regular sign, and then you have to add the irrigation sign. So I won't go into this. So I'm going to tell you what's wrong with these pictures. 1, you can barely see this. 2, if you could see it, it's the wrong sign. This is the federal sign. 3, the RA expired in 1999, meaning that it's been up for a long time. It's not really being used to indicate a restricted entry interval. What's wrong with this sign is that I was allowed to enter this field even though the sign was up. The REI had expired, but I should not have been able to enter this field. We are never allowed to make an employee enter a field where any of these field posting signs are, okay? Because the rule is don't go in there when the sign is posted. So then if you tell them, oh, this time it's fine, then they don't know when it's okay and when it's not, and they can't actually make a good decision on how to protect themselves, which is to say that you can't just leave the REI signs up. Once the REI expires, you can remove the sign, or you can wait 3 days after that expiration. Only 3 days though. But so long as the sign is up, nobody without early entry credentials can enter that field, period. Okay. So it just sort of behooves you to take it down when whenever the REI is done. So when you're making non-ag or urban areas, so I've been talking about ag specific stuff, notify the owners or residents of the treated property with information indicating the nature of the treatment, time and date of the treatment, and any special instructions. Usually for non-ag areas, you can't let people enter the area until the sprays have dried. That's typically what we say. So if you don't have a pesticide label to tell you what the restricted entry interval is, you need to make some educated decisions here. So we talked about using the safety data sheet. You can always refer to the hazards statements in section 2 of the safety data sheet. If they say fatal if inhaled, well, 4 hours is not a long enough REI. But you kind of have to guess what it is, but just be conservative because you don't want to expose people to too high concentration of residues if that's really not necessary. So the minimum, if you don't have a label, the minimum is 4 hours. 4-hour REI is minimum for anything that doesn't have, a registered label. But again, please add time if you notice that the hazard statement is alarming, or, 4 hours is the minimum. It's not the rule. It's simply the bare minimum that you should be doing. Okay. So if the hazard statements don't cause you any concern at all, then 4 hours is fine. But if they are harmful, corrosive, fatal, maybe fatal, irreversible, any of those words that you see in the hazard statements, yeah, I'll go over like 24 to 48 hours minimum. Okay. And then non-ag and urban areas, don't enter for 2 hours or until the treated area has dried. But when you're using solid formulations, just don't enter the area during the application. And these are just the minimum. You can always increase the level of safety. Standard industry care and practice should be observed. So for your own protection, when you're entering cooperator's field, either to make a pesticide application or maybe you're just going to do a farm call. So I would just verify with that farm owner or just your cooperator, like, is there, when was the last time this was sprayed? You want to know what the restricted entry interval is and if it has passed. So you don't want to be entering a field to do a farm call if there's an REI that's still in effect, because that's not safe for you. You don't have the PPE. You don't know anything about the pesticide. So double check any usual points of entry for REI warning signs. But please remember that we don't always have to post a warning sign, only in certain circumstances. So you could be walking into a field that has an REI in effect, but there's no warning sign. So you don't always know. So you have the right to check the application specific information, which employees have the right to do as well. But you may not know where that is if you're working with a cooperator and that's not your regular place that you're working. So check with them. And then follow up on any illnesses that you may, like if you suspect you went into a field and later that day you're feeling sick, don't brush it off. That's what I'm saying. Okay, so it's 11:53. I've had a couple of requests for some of these optional topics. I want to talk just real briefly about, I'm going to escape out of here for a second. Organic pesticides, because that's one that I promised to say something about. And then I can talk just briefly about pesticide applications near schools. I don't remember if the handouts include any of that. Sorry, I'm looking for the right slides. Okay, I just want to really quickly talk about organics because it came up. Okay. I'm not going to tell you everything there is to know about organic pesticide research. I'm just going to tell you like what the policy says essentially. So, or what my recommendations are. So, like the CCOF or the National Organic Program, whatever, the certifier needs to you need to make sure that your organic certifier is okay with whatever pesticides you're putting out there, even if they're certified organic. If it's not part of their farm plan, then the certifier may not approve it. So that really the grower needs to be checking with their third-party certifier to make sure they're okay with you all making these applications, even if they're organically approved. So these are a list of chemicals that are exempt from the requirement of a registration. Okay, they're called the 25B list. They're lower toxicity products. So if these are the active ingredients and there's no other active ingredient not on this list in that product, then technically it doesn't have to be registered, but it is not automatically exempt from a tolerance. So if you're applying stuff to food, like animal food or human food or drink, then it has to either have a registration or exemption from registration, tolerance or tolerance exemption. Otherwise, it's experimental. So if you don't have a registration or exemption from registration, that's fine. You can do that. It's an experimental trial. But you are not necessarily exempt from a tolerance with these lower toxicity materials. You do have to check and make sure you have a tolerance or an exemption from a tolerance. Katrina has been doing a lot of that searching recently, so we can sort of help identify if you are exempt from a tolerance, but that's just something to check. Typically, you want to keep your organically approved or certified materials separate in your pesticide storage. just so you don't accidentally grab, you know, conventional material and apply it to certified organic land. That would not be good. So OMRI is a great place to check for organic materials, but it is a paid service, meaning if the company doesn't pay to be on the OMRI list, then it's not on the OMRI list, even if it's organically approved. So things on the OMRI list are organically approved, but it's a subset of the materials that are organically approved, but it's a good search. And then the Washington State Department of Ag, they maintain a list. It's a PDF list. I assume that they update it fairly regularly with registered products that are compliant with the National Organic Program requirements. But again, just because it's organically approved, it also has to be part of like the organic farm plan. And then the certifier has to be okay with that being out there on the certified organic land.